Hey everyone. For chapter three, in the last chapter we looked at private sector public relations, but for chapter three we're looking at the history and the laws related to public sector. So, a couple things that I want you to know for this chapter. First off, kind of know the differences between federal, state, and local. The first couple of pages in your chapter talk about the differences between federal, state, and local public sector labor relations. So, kind of make sure you know the differences between those three and kind of how each one is laid out differently. So. Whereas in the last chapter we looked at a lot of different laws. The public sector has a lot of laws as well, but the one that I really want you to focus on is the Pendleton Act. This act, did a lot of different things. It created the federal merit system that still exists in a similar form today. It created like competitive exams, so people can be given an equal chance to get the job. It prevented you from firing somebody for political reasons. If somebody belonged to a certain political party, it prevented you from firing them because of that. And there's been a few others that have kind of added to that. But the Pendleton Act was kind of the original law that really set forward the rights for public sector labor relations. So make sure you know all about the Pendleton Act as you're reading through the chapter. There's a small section on it, but I think it's really important. It talks about fraternal organizations. I know a lot of us, if you have, friends or family who are police officers or who are, firefighters, they have their own, fraternal order. So the Fraternal Order of Police, Fraternal Order of Firefighters, things along those lines. Well, again, these fraternal organizations started off, as kind of, private groups of people in those jobs, but over time they've evolved into unions and they represent members of those jobs. So make sure you know about fraternal org. You don't have to memorize any names of anything, but just kind of understand what fraternal organizations do and how they developed. So. We just talked about the Pendleton Act, but even though this is technically not a law, it's still I'll put it in the category of a law that I think is incredibly important. It's Executive Order 10988. Executive Order 10988, and again, your book highlights it very heavily. It was issued by President Kennedy in the early 1960s. That, for lack of a better word, it basically gave federal employees, bargaining rights, the ability to come together with these government organizations and bargain for their wages, terms and conditions of employment, things along those lines. So again, if it wasn't for that order, that's kind of what set in motion the ability for current, state, local, and federal workers to be able to bargain effectively. So again, make sure you know what Executive Order 10988 did. And again, I think it's table 3.2 in this textbook does kind of again provide you kind of a summary and a history of public sector laws and some major points. Again, certainly don't need to memorize that chart, but I think it's a good table to kind of look at to kind of understand kind of the flow as time has gone on specifically. So. A couple of final things for chapter three that I want you to know. Obviously, being in the public sector, you have very different rights than in the private sector. So there are two things that I think are really important that I want you to know. One talks about what's called multilateral bargaining, and it's kind of bargaining that can happen across the legislative branch, the executive branch. Obviously something like that doesn't exist in the private sector. So and in addition to multilateral bargaining, your book talks about sunshine laws. And again, sunshine laws are very important to understand because, again, in certain states that have them, because it's a public entity, you might have to bargain, and those records are easily accessible because through FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. So again, a lot of states have done away with sunshine laws because for that reason, but make sure you understand what sunshine laws are and how they apply to states specifically. So. One of the biggest differences between public and private labor relations is the ability to strike. And in the private sector, striking happens pretty regularly, as you can imagine, and it's all governed by the NLRB. Well, the right to strike in public in the public sector is very, very limited and in a lot of ways non-existent at all. Again, there's a few laws fairly recent that kind of affect that a little bit. That's kind of outside the scope of this class. You don't have to worry about that. But generally, you cannot strike in the public sector. And there was a really famous thing that happened in the 1980s with President Reagan. The air traffic controllers, there was a union that represented all the air traffic controllers throughout the country. Well, they struck, because of working conditions, working long hours. Well, President Reagan basically fired them all because they were federal workers and replaced them. So if you just Google air traffic controller strike, take a second to do that and just read what happened as a result of them trying to strike and see what kind of how the federal government responded. It's really, really interesting. So again, I highly encourage you just to pull up a Google search and just type in air traffic controller strike from the 1980s. It's really, really interesting. So make sure you kind of understand in the textbook, what rights, if any, you have to strike as a public sector employee. And finally, the last thing I want you to focus on is what we call alternative dispute resolution, which has kind of two parts, mediation and arbitration. And again, your book has a good summary of how mediation differs from arbitration. Usually mediation is done informally. Arbitration can be binding, almost like a court hearing. So again, those are used they're used in the private sector too, but they're much more common in the public sector as a way for employees and government organizations to come to an agreement without basically having to get the courts overly involved. So again, those are kind of the main highlights for Chapter 3. Hope everyone's doing well, and we'll see you for Chapter 4. Thanks.